The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time is often considered to be one of the greatest and most influential games ever made. It was the first Zelda game in 3D back at a time when 3D was still a fairly new thing. This game basically paved the way for future Zelda games and others like it. And I've never played it. You know, I would consider myself a Zelda fan because all of the games I have played I have enjoyed immensely. The problem is I haven't played many of them. It's never been that I don't want to, but these games are a time commitment, and I've never really just sat down and played all of the ones I haven't yet. But with Tears of the Kingdom coming out soon, or probably already being out by the time this video is made, I'm finally in a bit of a Zelda mood and I want to get started playing some of the ones I haven't. And what better game to do that with than Ocarina of Time? The game starts off with the Great Deku Tree and a fairy named Navi talking about how evil has entered the world and that it is finally time to call upon some random child to save the world. But after finally gaining control of our main character, I was called upon by the Great Deku Tree. But this loser won't let me go without a sword and shield, so after gathering some rupees to buy a shield and probably taking way too long to find a sword, I made my way there. One thing that already stands out is the fact that the game wastes absolutely no time getting you into the gameplay. There aren't any long, drawn-out tutorials. The game gives you the items and information you need, and then you are right into the first dungeon. But after clearing this first dungeon, you are finally let loose into the world of Hyrule. Ocarina of Time does a great job of giving you a world that truly feels grand, at least by 1998 standards. But despite its large size, the world is absolutely full of charming characters and amazing places you can go. Hyrule Field acts as the main hub of the world and connects to all of the different places you will be going. For the most part, Hyrule Field is probably the emptiest part of the world, but I get the point of it was to show off how they could make bigger worlds like this on the new hardware of the N64. The only problem with this is that until you unlock warp points later on in the game, it can be a little annoying to travel between locations, especially when the game is left a little more open, so I wasn't exactly sure where I was supposed to go, meaning that I was walking back and forth between locations a lot, which probably took up most of my playtime. But eventually you do unlock some warp points and you can get a horse, which speeds up traveling a little bit. And for a game from this time, I wasn't expecting much extra stuff to do, but to my surprise there are tons of optional side quests you can do that give you all kinds of rewards. You can try and find all of the great fairies, you can try and help the mask salesman sell some masks, or you can find this cow. But later on in the game, you gain the ability to travel to the future, which makes the world go from this to this. When traveling to the future, you get to see how Ganondorf's rule has affected Hyrule, with a lot of places feeling abandoned and eerie. It's a really interesting contrast going back and forth from the past and the future, because it gives you that motivation to keep going to try and restore the world to what it used to be. On top of this, the future world also has its own side quests and new things to find. There are even some side objectives that require you to start in the past and then finish it in the future later. Like how to get Epona, you must first learn Epona's song as young Link, then go to the future to pay this guy 10 rupees to ride his horses. After doing that, you have to play Epona's song so that they will trust you, allowing you to ride them. Then some other stuff happens, like you race a guy, he traps you in his ranch, you know, the usual stuff. As much as I love the world that this game presents you and all of the characters in it, I do still have some criticisms. Traveling around can be a slog, especially near the beginning. Like I said, you do get a horse and warp points, but most of the warp points aren't super useful after you're finished with the dungeons in that area. You see, a lot of the main areas have two dungeons, like Death Mountain, Zora's Domain, and Kokiri Forest. And I think that if you could have unlocked those warp points on your first time through, it would have been more useful. You usually don't unlock these warp points until you travel back there a second time, which can be frustrating. The only warp point I consistently use in the game is the Temple of Time, since that is fairly close to everything in the game. I also think the game could be a little more clear about directions. Obviously, in the dungeons, I don't want them to tell me where to go or what to do, because that defeats the whole purpose. But when I'm just walking around in the overworld trying to find where to go, and all it tells me is to go to the Forest Temple with no indication of where that is, it can get slightly frustrating. The camera also is just not very good. The camera buttons on the N64 controller are used for items in this game, leaving not many places for the camera to go. This puts the camera on the Z button, which means that you have to face in the direction you want the camera to face, then press the button. This can make positioning the camera pretty frustrating, but it's made worse by the fact that the camera button is also the button you use to lock onto enemies. Now, I'm not trying to say that the targeting doesn't work well. I think it's a great great solution to 3D combat that so many modern games use. But when it is mapped to the same button as the camera, it means that sometimes when you mean to target an enemy, you just end up facing a slightly different direction and vice versa. Ultimately, these are not huge gripes, but rather just the game showing its age a little bit, and I think it's still important that those problems are acknowledged. While stuff like the overworld and characters are important, the biggest part of what makes a Zelda game are the dungeons, unless the game is Breath of the Wild. In my opinion, all of the Young Link dungeons have the more interesting ideas for the setting of the dungeon. You explore the inside of a wise tree, a mine inside of a giant volcano, the inside of a giant fish, and of course whatever this is. But a lot of the adult Link dungeons are just water temple, fire temple, and stuff like that. But I would argue that the adult Link dungeons are much larger and just designed better overall. The forest temple stands out to me as probably one of the better dungeons in the game. Hunting down all of the ghosts is pretty fun, and I like the rooms that twist around. I also enjoyed the shadow temple quite a bit. I liked how it was a bit more linear than some of the other dungeons in the game, so it made it slightly easier to navigate. I always hear awful things about the water dungeon, and I mean it wasn't great, but I didn't find it any more frustrating than any of the other dungeons. I just sort of wish that these dungeons could have had more interesting setups like the Young Link dungeons. That way we could have had good dungeons that were also a bit more creative, but I still do like the dungeons that we did get. I will say that whether I liked each dungeon or not, all of them are super memorable, whether it be for their setting or gimmick. Each dungeon feels completely unique from the others, and I really appreciate that as it makes the playthrough feel more varied. But going back to some of the complaints, especially when you are in a tight space, attacking enemies can be a huge pain. Since you can't move the camera normally, if you want to be looking at an enemy, you have to be locked onto it, but then that means you can't be locked onto the other enemies, and it can just make it very annoying to fight them. It isn't as big of a deal in the larger, more open areas, but in the small rooms of some of the dungeons, it can get very annoying. But at the end of each dungeon, we have, of course, the bosses. For the most part, the bosses are very simple once you figure out how to deal with them. Except for a few cases, most of them have one phase, and once you figure it out, it's just repeating the same steps over and over again, but most of them are still pretty fun though. Each boss feels completely unique from the others and always has some cool idea behind it, like this weird ghost form of Ganon, or this cool fire dragon, or Bongo Bongo. The dungeons are definitely the highlight of this game because they are what everything else revolves around. The giant hub worlds are meant to get to the dungeons, the story is meant to show you why you are going to the dungeons, and the dungeons are there to be the dungeons. Overall, while this game is still great, I don't think it is as good as it is made out to be. The game has just simply aged poorly in some areas, and it makes it hard to enjoy the game as much as I would have liked to. I spent quite a lot of time being fairly frustrated while playing because the game is just not always super clear on what it is you should be doing, and sometimes the camera was just a little too much for me to try and deal with that day. But despite these flaws, this game is still great and has been super influential to future games in the Zelda series and ones that aren't. But ultimately, I think that we just have better Zelda games that we can play now, and that's okay. Just because we have games that are, in my opinion, better now, doesn't mean that this one isn't special anymore, or that it can't be your favorite. But at the end of the day, I'm really glad I'm done with this video, so I can go play Tears of the Kingdom now. Bye.